In this video on reading fluency, I will define what reading fluency is, and I'll talk about how we can use instruction to boost the skills that contribute to fluency. At the end of the video, I'll provide resources for lesson planning. So what is fluency? One of the most commonly misunderstood concepts about fluency is that it has to do with speed, but fluency really isn't about reading fast. At the heart of fluency is the skill of automaticity. We need children to be able to lift words off the page automatically and with ease so they can devote their cognitive energy to the task of comprehension. This doesn't mean fluent readers are recognizing words as whole units. They are still processing each letter of the word, but the process by which this happens for skilled readers is incredibly fast. Fluent readers also read with expression and proper phrasing, understanding the role of grammar and syntax in what they read. We know there are certain skills that are required to lead to fluency, and they're listed here: letter-sound correspondence, knowledge of the pronunciation of words, decoding and encoding ability, orthographic mapping, which requires advanced phonemic proficiency, and I will talk about that in great detail in this video, and understanding of syntax and grammar, which leads to prosody, reading with expression. So let's talk about repeated readings, which I abbreviate as RR on this slide. Do repeated readings work to boost fluency? One of the most common practices used to address fluency are repeated readings, where students read a passage while a teacher times them. Then the student repeats the passage and tries to read a bit faster and a bit more accurately each time. There are some short-term gains in word reading accuracy and speed on the passages that are used to practice repeated readings, but these gains are not generalized to unpracticed passages. So repeated readings don't help close the gap between struggling readers and proficient readers because repeated readings don't address the underlying reasons why a child is struggling to read in the first place. This doesn't mean that we need to throw out the practice of repeated readings altogether. Repeated readings can be useful to practice phrasing and expression. Because a student is comfortable with the text while doing repeated readings, they can devote cognitive energy to infusing expression into their reading. So it can be a useful way to practice expression. Oral reading fluency can be thought of as taking your students' reading temperature. So if we think about oral reading fluency as a thermometer, the first step is to take the student's temperature, their oral reading fluency rate, to see if there's an underlying issue that must be addressed. To get a student's oral reading fluency rate, we have a student read a grade level passage aloud for 1 minute and track their words read correctly in that minute. You then measure the words read per minute against the oral reading fluency norms that are listed later on in this presentation. They're also available online. These norms show if your student is on track or below the expected norms. Research shows that the goal for most students is to have an oral reading fluency that's at least in the 50th percentile. When students score below the 50th percentile, their comprehension is likely impaired. If a student's fluency is weak, you need to find out the underlying reason why. A low oral reading fluency is the symptom, not the cause of the problem, and you have to treat the cause. Just as a fever is an indication that there is something wrong in the body, a low oral reading fluency score is an indication that a reader is struggling with one or more of the foundational skills of reading. Intervention must be focused on the sub-skill that is weak. So the task is to identify which foundational skills are missing or still difficult for that student. For example, a letter sound assessment will show if a student is struggling with a particular digraph. A decoding assessment will show if a student has a decoding weakness, such as vowel teams. A phonemic awareness assessment will reveal if that student is struggling with one of the required phonemic awareness skills to become a fluent reader. When the focus of teaching is on the sub-skills of reading, the oral reading fluency rate will go up as a result of that intervention. Remember that oral reading fluency is truly a measure of the student's automaticity with the underlying foundational skills of reading. So let's talk about orthographic mapping, which we can think about as the bridge to fluency. Orthographic mapping is the process by which readers store written words for immediate, effortless retrieval. Orthographic mapping builds sight words, and sight words lead to reading fluency. So let's pause and define what a sight word is. A sight word is any word that can be recognized instantly and effortlessly, whether or not it's spelled regularly or does not follow spelling rules. We used to think that with enough exposures to looking at a word, it could be memorized. But thousands of scientific studies have shown that sight word development is actually not based on memorizing words by visual input. We know now that we store words in memory based on the sound structure of the word and the spelling of the word. So if we look at the word orthographic, ortho means correct, graph means to write. So orthographic has to do with the correct way to write words. Orthographic mapping is all about making connections between the sounds in words and their correct spellings. We connect or we map the sounds of words to the sequence of the letters we see printed on the page. The sequence of letters in a word becomes a unit that is stored in memory. So how are words stored in memory? Children take the pronunciations of the words they know and connect them to the spellings of words. The knowledge of the letter sound correspondences that we teach students act as the glue that connects spellings to pronunciations in memory. This process allows readers to store written words for immediate, effortless retrieval. So what skills do our students need to build a bank of sight words? Becoming a fluent reader requires a large bank of sight words. In order to build this bank, there are 3 skills our students need. Number 1, they need knowledge of phonemic segmentation. They need to be able to separate and manipulate the sounds within words. Number 2, they need letter-sound correspondence. And number 3, they need knowledge of the correct pronunciation of words. So what's the difference between orthographic mapping and decoding? Decoding is used to identify a word using letter-sound skills. Orthographic mapping uses sound-to-letter skills to create a memory of printed words. With orthographic mapping, students take the whole word, break it into its sound parts, and connect the letters or letter combinations to those sounds. Decoding and orthographic mapping are different processes and both are essential to reading. When students are learning to read, they have to sound out or decode the word. As they read more, they start to recognize words without having to decode them sound by sound. This happens because the correct sequence of letters gets anchored to the pronunciations of words in long-term memory. Struggling readers need explicit instruction to develop the underlying skills required for orthographic mapping. So a student can be good at sounding out words because the student has received excellent phonics instruction. But if that student has limited phonemic skills, meaning they have limited ability to pull the sounds apart in a word, then that student is not going to be able to recognize words automatically. It's so important to remember that phonemic proficiency is the essential skill that leads to the ability to recognize words automatically. So what about mapping irregular words? The mapping process works for irregular words as well, and this video here will provide a short tutorial on how this process works and how you can teach mapping for irregular words. In this video, I'm going to show you a teaching technique for words that don't follow the expected or the most common letter sound correspondences. We consider these words irregular words, but they can be partially decoded. Most irregular words only have one or two parts that are irregular. Irregular words are words that present a challenge for decoding for one or two reasons. Because either one, the sounds of the letters are unique to that word or to a very small number of words. For example, in the words one and once, those are the only times we hear the letter O represented by the sound wa, or the letter O making the sound wa. Or number two, the word presents a decoding challenge because the student has not yet learned the letter sound correspondences in that word. So here is the protocol for teaching irregular words. In this example, I'll be using the word bin. So you have the sound B represented by the letter B, and at the end of the word you have the sound N represented by the letter N. Those are both expected. And in the middle you have EE, and the sound that EE is making is I. That's unexpected. It's not the most common letter sound correspondence. So what you can do when you're teaching is you can have students underline the irregular part and draw a heart over the irregular part to signify that is the part they need to learn by heart. It's really helpful when you're teaching irregular words like this to group words by the part they have in common that is irregular, such as grouping other, mother, brother, another. And another example of a group of words that share an irregular common part would be could, would, should. So you would go through that same process I went through for bin with those groups of words. Remember what we know about orthographic mapping and connecting the sounds inside of words to their corresponding letter sequences. So when you introduce an irregular word, always ask the students how many sounds the word has when you begin to study that word. So in the word bin, how many sounds do we hear? And help the students isolate those sounds and count them. We hear b, I, n, b, I, n. We hear 3 sounds. Next, start with the expected, the regular parts of the word. So to start, we hear the sound b. What letter represents the sound b? B. Then go to the next expected part of the word. At the end of the word, what sound do you hear? You hear the sound n. The letter N represents the sound n. What sound do you hear in the middle of the word bin? You hear the sound I. In the word bin, the letters EE represent the sound I. This is the irregular part of the word. This is the part you need to learn by heart. So what skills do we need to teach to enable successful orthographic mapping? First, we have to remember that almost all struggling readers have what's called a phonological core deficit, which means they struggle with phonemic awareness. The skills of phonemic awareness must be trained explicitly. Children with weak phoneme awareness will not develop adequate reading skills and will always struggle with achieving fluency in reading comprehension unless they achieve high levels of phonemic awareness. So within the umbrella term of phonemic awareness, there are several sub-skills that vary in degree of difficulty. It's crucial that we get students to the level of mastery of the most challenging level of phonemic awareness, which is down here, number 5, phony manipulation. So let's look at the sequence or the hierarchy of phonemic awareness skills listed from the easiest to the most challenging. So number 1, rhyme detection, followed by rhyme production, sound blending, sound segmenting, and phoneme manipulation. So an example of phoneme manipulation, teacher says, say the word stop. Student says stop. Teacher says, now change the sound t to the sound ooh. What's the new word? And the student is expected to say slap. We want students to be able to manipulate sounds quickly within 2 seconds. Many literacy programs stop at the skills of blending and segmenting, but so they stop here kind of around 3 and 4. But without getting to down here at this most advanced skill, students can actually get stuck at the skill of decoding decoding words letter by letter, and they lack automaticity and they lack fluency. So David Kilpatrick has developed 1-minute drills designed to boost phonemic awareness skills. These drills are 100% auditory and don't involve any letters. You can also use a free screener called a PAST, which I've linked at the end of this presentation, to determine your student's phoneme proficiency level so you know where to begin the drills. It's best to sprinkle activities throughout the day. Multiple exposures are key. Building phonemic proficiency will have a huge payoff in terms of building your students' bank of sight words, which leads to fluency, which will lead to the ultimate goal of reading comprehension. You can, of course, combine phonemic awareness with phonics by introducing letters, as you see here in the mapping examples. So here you're segmenting and counting sounds and then matching sounds to the letter or letters that represent those sounds. So here you see in this example, you say the word, students repeat the word. In this example here, you're having kind of adding a visual piece. What do you picture when you say that word? You're always ensuring that the students can segment and isolate the sounds in that word and count the sounds. Adding a manipulative is a great way. Tokens, magnets. If you don't have any manipulatives, you can always just draw lines on a whiteboard to represent sounds. And then when you've segmented the sounds, you're going to match up the sounds to the letters that represent those sounds. So to really imprint the spelling for students, it's always a good idea to, within the mapping process, to extend the learning and ask questions such as which letter says A, where is that sound, to really draw their attention to whether they're hearing that sound in the beginning, the middle, or the end of the word. So here you can see some guided questions to work through as you're helping imprint the spelling for your students. Decoding and encoding skills are essential for fluent reading. So ensuring students are given multiple exposures and repeated practice with phonics at each concept skill point throughout Wilson is really the best way to build strong decoding at the word level. Once the specific concept has been taught and mastered with real words, focus on nonsense words in order to build up automaticity and reduce a student's ability to guess. And don't forget dictation. Dictating words to spell, in addition to having students read word lists, helps and build automaticity with word recognition. Spelling is a much more difficult task than reading, but if a child can spell a word, you know they'll be able to read it automatically. So don't give up on spelling. Even when doing the letter drills as a warm-up, always make sure to do them in reverse. So for example, when you have the flashcards and you're showing the letters, showing a letter A with the picture on it, and you're asking them to produce A, apple, always make sure you're asking them the question in reverse. So you're asking them, what spells the sound A? This skill directly contributes to spelling, which will enhance fluency and also really improve writing as well. So using Elkonin boxes is a great way to build phonemic awareness, decoding, and encoding. Elkonin boxes are also called sound boxes, and they build phonemic awareness by segmenting words into individual sounds or phonemes. To use Elkonin boxes, a child listens to a word and moves a token into a box for each sound or phoneme. Students can draw a dot in each box to represent a sound, or use a whiteboard with pre-drawn boxes and simply erase the dots each time you dictate a word. Sound boxes teach students how to count the number of phonemes in the word, which is not always the same as the number of letters, such as here with the example of stuck, st, you have 4 sounds, but of course, because of the CK digraph, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 letters. When children have successfully segmented the sounds in a word, you can work with them to map the correct spellings onto those sounds. As you work on phonemic awareness, always make sure students are able to successfully pull apart all of the sounds in a word before you map letters onto the word. Here's an example of how to map the magic E with Elkonin or sound boxes. Some teachers like to put it here outside of the box. Some teachers like to put it small right here next to the final consonant. As long as you're consistent and find a way that makes sense for your students, that's what matters. Word chains are also an effective way to build the neural connections students need for automatic word recognition through orthographic mapping. This activity helps to map the orthography, the spellings of words, to the sounds they represent, the pronunciations. You can easily use Elkonin boxes, letter flashcards, or tiles, or tokens with a whiteboard for this activity. So here is what this looks like. You're going to always want to prepare a list of words ahead of time. You match the words to the phonics skills that you're studying in Wilson to make sure that you're reinforcing those skills. Ask a student to say a word. For example, mad. Ask the student to count the sounds in the word using dots or tokens. D, 3 sounds. Ask the student to write the word or use magnetic tiles to spell it. After they spell the word, make sure they tap each sound and then say the word. Ask the student to change a sound so that mad says sad, and repeat the process of counting the sounds in the word. Keep going for anywhere between 7 to 10 words, making new words. So a couple things to keep in mind, a few tips. Only change one sound or spelling at a time. Make sure students are identifying which sound, not which letter, to change. So try not to tell the student which letter to change. If they make a mistake, you can prompt them to tap the sounds, actually put their finger on each token or whatever you're using to represent the sounds and the word, and check their work by tapping each sound. There are 3 ways to change the word. So number 1, you could change a sound. You could, for example, change a sound so that cat says bat. 2, you can add a sound. Add a sound so that in says chin. And 3, you can delete a sound. For example, take a sound away so that tan says an. And down here you have an example of a word chain. Word chains reinforce the relationship between phonemes and graphemes as students listen for one phoneme change in a word at a time and then respond by making the appropriate spelling change. So building prosody is another really important part of fluency. It's important to model for students what fluent reading sounds like. Modeling fluent reading can be done in a variety of ways. Echo reading, scooping the sentence for a student, and demonstrating appropriate vocal pauses, or discussing punctuation and how different types affect the way a sentence is read. Acting out a scene in a story with lots of opportunities to practice and providing feedback on expression also provides great practice. Listening to audiobooks is another way to give students an example of what reading with expression sounds like, and as a bonus, it gives great exposure to complex syntactic structures and vocabulary. But nothing can replace explicitly teaching the sub-skills that are required for fluent reading. So let's talk about progress monitoring. How do we measure oral reading fluency? Fluency is measured by having students read a passage aloud at their independent reading level and tracking their words correct per minute. Once a student's words correct per minute is measured, it should be measured against this chart here in order to assess where a student is in relation to the grade level percentiles. And I mentioned before that research shows that the goal for students is to have an oral reading fluency that's in the 50th percentile of words read correct per minute, which below the 50th percentile, comprehension is impaired, and above the 50th percentile, we don't really see a lot of gains in comprehension, meaning faster and faster reading is not really that useful. So here are some tips for measuring your students' fluency. I'm not going to go read these, but it's helpful to have these kind of logistical tips at hand when you're ready to actually measure the 1 minute oral reading fluency. So what if you find that your student is decoding accurately but is still struggling with comprehension? If the student is decoding accurately but slowly, so let's say below the 50th percentile, the student is likely still developing orthographic mapping skills, and continued practice with that will help. So remember that oral reading fluency is truly a byproduct of having an extremely large bank of sight words that can be read instantly. So until this develops, a student's reading will likely be slow. If the student is accurate but lacks comprehension, that student is likely expending too much cognitive effort on decoding and has not developed a robust sight word vocabulary. Remember, every word can be a sight word and recognized instantly through orthographic mapping. If the student's reading rate is at the 50th percentile and that student is still struggling with comprehension, a diagnostic look must be taken at the underlying language skills that are required for skilled comprehension. The student could be struggling with vocabulary, and maybe not just singular definitions of words, but different meanings of words and really depth of word knowledge. Perhaps it's syntax that's tripping them up, or lack of background knowledge, or verbal reasoning such as inference and metaphor. Deficits in one or more of these foundational language areas will result in weakened comprehension. Comprehension is such a complex topic that there's a separate video guide devoted solely to that topic. So here are some resources for lesson planning. The first one is a fabulous resource for teaching irregular words through the University of Florida. It has lesson plans, tutorials. There are pre-made Google slides that are ready to go for your class. The second one, David Kilpatrick 1 minute drills in the past, which is available online to determine where your student's level is, so you know where to begin the drills. The sound popper is a kind of fidget that can be useful and fun for students to count out sounds in a word. Number 5 is this Elkonin soundbox template. Number 6 is more information and activities and how to use Elkonin boxes. Number 7 is how you can find passages to use for assessment for finding your students' oral reading fluency. And 8 and 9 are a series of quick but incredibly helpful and informative videos on orthographic mapping.